It began not in Moscow, but in a small, windowless room in Maryland, where a CIA physician stared at a man who no longer remembered his own name and realized too late that the United States had created something it could no longer control. The year was 1962, and the Cold War had entered the stage where paranoia became policy. America believed the Kremlin was building mind weapons. The Kremlin believed America already had them. And between those beliefs, both superpowers descended into a psychological arms race, far more dangerous than nuclear brinkmanship, because unlike missiles, thoughts leave no trail. The man in the Maryland room was one of the last survivors of the CIA's MK-Ultra experiments, programs designed to break a human mind into pieces and rearrange the fragments into something useful. But what Langley didn't know was that the Kremlin had been watching the program collapse, learning from every mistake, every overdose, every ruined mind. The Soviets were not simply reacting to MK-Ultra. They were harvesting its failures. Their goal was not to control the human mind, but to destroy the enemy's confidence in their own intelligence system. And the CIA, blinded by its obsession with mind control, walked directly into the trap. The roots of this disaster stretch back to the early 1950s, when American intelligence panicked after watching captured U.S. soldiers in Korea confess to crimes they never committed. Washington was convinced the Soviets had developed a brainwashing technology capable of rewriting loyalty. The truth was simpler. Torture, isolation, and sleep deprivation, not science fiction, had pushed soldiers beyond mental endurance. But in Langley, the nuance was lost. The CIA believed it faced a psychological superweapon, and paranoia disguised as urgency became the justification for one of the largest illegal human experiments in history. MK-Ultra was authorized in 1953 under Director Allen Dulles, a man who believed communism spread like a virus, and the human mind was the battlefield of the future. His scientists were told to explore everything: LSD, hypnosis, electroshock, sensory deprivation, radio frequencies, and experimental drugs that had killed lab animals in minutes. They tested on prisoners, mental patients, addicts, students, soldiers, and sometimes their own employees. Thousands of lives were shredded, dozens vanished, files disappeared, and yet after 2 decades, the CIA had achieved nothing except chaos. There was no mind control, no secret technique, no miracle breakthrough. But in Moscow, the KGB saw something far more valuable than results. They saw opportunity. While the CIA was melting minds, the Soviets were studying how the U.S. responded to failure, what they covered up, how they lied to Congress, how they destroyed documents, how they explained the deaths. MK-Ultra became a mirror into the psychology of American intelligence, and the KGB exploited that mirror better than any weapon they'd ever built. By the early 1970s, the KGB's Directorate K, responsible for counterintelligence, launched Operation NAVODCHIK, an initiative to feed disinformation into America's obsession with mind control. They used defectors, forged documents, whispered rumors, and manipulated scientists already disillusioned with their CIA handlers. The genius of the plan was that the Soviets didn't invent new fears. They amplified the ones that the CIA already had. If Langley feared psychic soldiers, the KGB leaked stories of Soviet telepaths. If Langley feared hypnosis assassins, the KGB planted journalists claiming Moscow already had them. Every fake rumor triggered another CIA experiment, another scandal, another internal purge. The CIA began to fear itself. Meanwhile, the man in the Maryland room, the broken survivor, became the symbol of everything the CIA denied and everything the Soviets understood. His memories were scrambled from years of LSD overdoses and electroshock sessions. His identity had been erased, rewritten, and erased again. And yet, when declassified Soviet files surfaced decades later, researchers discovered something chilling. The KGB had known his name, the program he was in, and the experiments his handler performed before the U.S. Congress did. That meant the Kremlin had penetrated MK-Ultra while it was still active. Not physically, but psychologically. They understood the CIA's behavior better than the CIA understood itself. They weaponized American paranoia. They played into Dulles' fears and let him destroy his own agency from within. As MKUltra collapsed under internal investigations in 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all files destroyed, an act that, ironically, confirmed everything the KGB needed. A government willing to erase evidence was a government in panic. A government in panic was easy to manipulate, and panic spread fast. Scientists threatened to sue. Foreign governments demanded answers. Congress began closed-door hearings. Former test subjects began surfacing with missing memories, hallucinations, nightmares, and neurological damage. Newspapers caught wind of the story, and while America scrambled to bury its sins, the Kremlin began the second phase of its operation, exporting the myth of Soviet mind control. It was subtle at first, articles in obscure journals claiming Soviet psychic breakthroughs, strange testimonies from defectors who spoke about remote influence, rumors of research teams in Leningrad working on telepathic communication. None of it is true, all of it is believable, and all of it designed to exploit the CIA's greatest weakness, embarrassment. If the CIA had publicly admitted MKUltra was a failure, the myth would have died. Instead, they hid it. And that secrecy proved to the world that something must have existed. By the late 1970s, American newspapers were publishing headlines about Soviet psychic warfare, Kremlin telepaths, and Russian mind weapons. Stories sourced from KGB-controlled leaks. The Kremlin didn't need real psychic soldiers. They just needed America to believe they had them. And America did. Nowhere was the paranoia more destructive than inside the CIA's own training academies. Recruits were told the KGB might be using hypnosis in interrogations. Field officers were instructed to suspect that Soviet handlers could plant psychological triggers. Psychological resistance manuals were rewritten based on information the KGB deliberately leaked. The CIA built an entire defensive doctrine around a weapon that never existed. Meanwhile, the real KGB focused on classic counterintelligence: bribery, blackmail, surveillance, infiltration. But America was too distracted chasing psychic ghosts to notice. This was the KGB's masterpiece, a psychological operation so subtle that even after the Soviet Union collapsed, American agencies still debated whether Soviet mind control programs were real. They weren't. The Soviets never needed psychic weapons. They had America's fear of them. MKUltra didn't fail because the science was impossible. It failed because the CIA misunderstood its own enemy. The Kremlin never sought to control minds. They sought to control narratives. And narratives, unlike neurons, are easy to manipulate. The Maryland survivor died in 1984, alone, with no memory of who he had been. His case file was sealed for 30 years. When it was opened, investigators found something strange. Half the pages referenced information that the CIA never possessed. But the KGB did. How the Soviets acquired those details remains unknown. Some believe there was a mole. Others believe the KGB simply listened to American fears and filled in the blanks. But one truth is undeniable. MKUltra damaged the CIA far more than it ever damaged the Kremlin. It wasted billions. It destroyed lives. It exposed weaknesses. It birthed scandals. It consumed itself. And it handed the KGB the psychological high ground on a silver platter. By the time the program ended, America was terrified of ghosts, and the Soviets were studying the ghosts. The CIA had tried to create the ultimate mind weapon, and instead created a vulnerability its enemies used for decades. And at the center of it all was a broken man in a dark room in Maryland, whose mind had become a battlefield the moment he lost his name. His silence said everything. You don't need to control a mind to win a war. You only need to convince your enemy that you can. As the shadows of MKUltra stretched across the 1970s, the KGB realized that the CIA had done something extraordinary. It had publicly humiliated itself without ever admitting the truth. And that humiliation was a resource more valuable than any stolen document. To the Kremlin, The greatest intelligence victory was not stealing secrets, but shaping how America saw itself. So while Washington scrambled to bury the wreckage of its failed mind experiments, the KGB began engineering a myth that made the U.S. appear unstable, desperate, and morally compromised. This myth, cultivated through forged research papers, staged testimonies, manipulated journalists, and fabricated defector stories, slowly convinced the world that America had invented a mind control weapon, lost control of it, and was still hiding its existence. Strangely, the CIA's own secrecy provided the glue. The harder the agency tried to suppress MK-Ultra, the more believable the Soviet narrative became. And this was the brilliance of the Kremlin's approach. They didn't need to build psychic warriors. They simply needed America to look like it had tried and failed. The MK-Ultra scandal made the U.S. intelligence community appear reckless and unhinged, feeding directly into the KGB's favorite propaganda theme: the decadent West collapsing under its own madness. Operation NAVODCHIK unfolded quietly. It didn't rely on spies sneaking into laboratories. The KGB studied American media, academic journals, congressional hearings, and internal CIA memos. Anything that revealed how the U.S. responded to stress, scandal, and political embarrassment. They discovered something crucial. In the American system, scandals grow legs. A leaked document turns into a newspaper story. A newspaper story becomes a Senate hearing. A Senate hearing becomes a televised spectacle, and the entire world watches. In the Soviet system, scandals die in the dark. The KGB decided to weaponize this cultural difference by feeding America's scandal machine until it consumed itself. So they seeded rumors about Soviet mind control superweapons to trigger panic inside Langley. Then they leaked whispers claiming CIA telepaths had gone rogue. Each rumor pushed the CIA to investigate itself again, digging deeper into the wreckage of MK-Ultra, ensuring the scandal would never truly end. At the core of NAVODCHIK was a simple principle. Credibility comes not from truth, but from consistency. The KGB didn't flood the world with wild claims. They created a slow drip of believable half-truths. An anonymous letter from an alleged Soviet defector mailed to a university psychology department. A research paper citing classified Soviet studies that no one could verify because the Soviets themselves claimed the documents were restricted notes, accidentally left behind by diplomats at embassy events. Muted references in Soviet-authored scientific publications, just subtle enough to be plausible. And in America, journalists desperate for Cold War scoops amplified it all. When a reporter for the Washington Star published a piece in 1977 claiming evidence of Soviet psychic influence experiments, no one realized his anonymous source was a KGB asset. The CIA did what the CIA always did: panic. They reopened divisions, reactivated old scientists, and poured millions into countermeasures for imaginary threats. Each dollar spent made the myth stronger. Each classified memo confirmed to the Soviets that their psychological warfare had hit its target. The most devastating part was how the CIA's own structure made it vulnerable. Because MK-Ultra had been illegal, only a handful of people knew its full extent. Many senior officials didn't know about the program's failures. Others didn't know its methods. Some believed it had worked. Others believed it was a hoax. That confusion gave the KGB enormous power. They didn't need to hack the CIA. They only needed to watch different departments contradict each other, and contradict they did. Counterintelligence officers suspected psychic infiltration. Medical officers insisted hypnosis had been used in foreign interrogations. Field agents reported illusions and hallucinations during surveillance operations. The CIA wasn't just fighting ghosts, it was inventing them, and the KGB gladly took notes. Meanwhile, inside Moscow's Yasenevo headquarters, analysts studied every MK-Ultra leak with the same seriousness they reserved for nuclear intelligence. The program fascinated them, not as a scientific breakthrough, but as a window into American insecurity. They correctly predicted that the CIA would never admit MK-Ultra had failed. They predicted Congress would react slowly, partially, and inconsistently. They predicted the American public would fill in the blanks with conspiracy theories, and they were right. By the late 1970s, American bookstores were filled with titles like The CIA's Secret Brainwashing Program and Telepaths of the Kremlin. These books weren't just profitable, they were strategic. Each one added a layer of confusion, making it harder for the average citizen to distinguish truth from rumor. Democracy's greatest strength, freedom of information, became its greatest weakness. And then came the incident that nearly pushed the CIA over the edge. In 1978, a low-ranking embassy worker in Vienna reported that a Soviet diplomat had approached him with an offer to provide documents proving Soviet mind control advancements. The diplomat handed him a sealed envelope marked with the insignia of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. Inside were pages describing alleged breakthroughs in remote neural interference. Pure fiction written by KGB psychologists. The CIA treated it as gospel. Internal memos warned of a cognitive manipulation threat. Training manuals were revised. Agents were instructed to practice mental shielding techniques. Field officers were told to avoid reflecting surfaces and flashing lights during interrogations. It would have been absurd if it hadn't been tragic. Real-world intelligence operations were delayed or canceled because analysts feared Soviet psychic surveillance lives were lost, missions failed, and through it all, the KGB never once mentioned psychic abilities again. They didn't have to. The CIA was doing the work for them. By the early 1980s, MK Ultra had mutated from a defunct experiment into a cultural virus. Hollywood films portrayed mind-controlled assassins. Newspapers speculated about subliminal warfare. Academics debated whether the human mind could be accessed remotely. And in the shadows, the KGB's narrative spread across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Nations skeptical of U.S. influence suddenly believed America had attempted to weaponize the mind. Some governments demanded diplomatic assurances. Others launched their own investigations. The CIA's failure became the world's entertainment, and the Kremlin's proof that the West was just as morally bankrupt as the propaganda posters claimed. The final blow came in 1983, when a Soviet disinformation cell forged a United Nations report alleging the U.S. had tested mind-controlled drugs on foreign prisoners. The report was sophisticated, footnotes referencing real medical studies, citations from real conferences, and signatures mimicking genuine officials. Dozens of newspapers reported on it before the forgery was exposed. But by then, the damage was done. For the first time in modern history, America was morally compared not to democratic nations, but to the dictatorships it condemned and the KGB celebrated. NAVODCHIK had exceeded expectations. Yet the CIA still didn't understand the magnitude of what had happened. They believed MK Ultra was a scandal, a mistake, a stain they needed to hide. They never realized it had become a weapon they handed to their enemy, a weapon the enemy used without firing a shot. Moscow had turned America's paranoia into a tool of destabilization, and the U.S. intelligence community, the most powerful in the world, had allowed it because they were too ashamed to admit the truth. In the end, the KGB didn't infiltrate the CIA's laboratories, offices, or computers. They infiltrated something far more important: its fears. MK Ultra had been a scientific disaster, but its legacy evolved into something worse: a self-inflicted psychological wound the Kremlin exploited for decades. And as the American public continued asking the wrong questions, did it work? How powerful was it? How many victims were there? The right question remained buried. Who benefited from the belief that America once tried to control the human mind? The answer was written in red ink in Yasenevo. Me. We did. By the time the CIA realized the KGB had turned MK Ultra into a global psychological trap, the agency was already fractured from within, haunted by scandals it couldn't outrun and failures it couldn't explain. In Langley headquarters, the halls were quiet in the way only institutions burdened by shame become quiet. Everyone walking fast, speaking softly, and avoiding eye contact, as if the building itself had become contaminated. Analysts whispered about the damage, referring not to the ruined lives of test subjects, but to the agency's credibility, something far more fragile than classified documents or covert networks. MK Ultra had revealed an ugly truth. The CIA was willing to violate its own citizens in the name of national security. And when the experiments failed, it had tried to erase the evidence. The KGB didn't need to expose anything more. America had already destroyed its own image. But the Kremlin wasn't satisfied with that. They wanted the wound to stay open, to never fully heal, to sit like a bruise beneath every CIA decision for decades. So they shifted their strategy. Operation NAVODCHIK entered its third phase, not amplifying America's guilt, but manipulating it. Throughout the 1980s, the CIA began receiving bizarre reports from field stations, agents claiming they were being mentally influenced, others reporting hallucinations during surveillance, some insisting they felt sudden chills or intrusive thoughts when encountering Soviet operatives. These were not real psychic attacks. They were the psychological fallout of a decade of paranoia. MK Ultra had taught CIA officers that the mind could be tampered with, and NAVODCHIK taught them that the Soviets were doing it. Now the officers lived in a perpetual state of cognitive dread, unsure whether their own thoughts could be trusted. Internal memos described mysterious symptoms spreading through field teams, but medical examinations revealed nothing. Some officers abruptly resigned. Others developed drinking problems. One senior analyst even suffered a breakdown during a briefing, shouting that the KGB had hacked his dreams. Washington dismissed the episode as stress, but in Moscow, Directorate K added it to their files under the category effects, psychological disruption induced through disinformation exposure. In other words, the operation was working. Meanwhile, the CIA's counterintelligence division descended into a kind of institutional delusion. Under the leadership of the infamous James Jesus Angleton, paranoia was not a symptom. It was doctrine. Angleton believed the KGB had infiltrated every branch of the U.S. government, using methods far beyond traditional espionage. He suspected hypnosis, dream manipulation, and subconscious suggestion. Angleton tore apart the careers of countless innocent officers, convinced they had been psychologically compromised. He destroyed friendships, interrogated colleagues harshly, and accused some of treason with no evidence. And in a brutal twist, everything he did strengthened Moscow's position. While the CIA hunted imaginary psychic infiltrators, the real KGB agents, those using classic espionage, not superstition, operated freely. They watched the CIA implode from within, tearing itself apart in pursuit of an enemy that didn't exist. This internal chaos was not a side effect of MK Ultra. It was the intended outcome. The KGB understood that organizations break not from physical attacks, but from cognitive ones. If you can make an enemy doubt their own senses, their own memories, their own logic, you can dismantle them without firing a shot. And that is exactly what happened. MK Ultra had destabilized the internal psychology of the CIA. NAVODCHIK, weaponized the instability. The result was an agency that no longer trusted its own shadow. The impact reached beyond Langley. In the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union neared collapse, a young KGB analyst named Igor Sergeyev discovered something astonishing. MK Ultra had become so infamous that foreign intelligence services, including Britain's MI6, France's DGSE, and West Germany's BND, began quietly questioning whether the United States might still be hiding a functional mind control program. The irony was cosmic. America had never mastered mind control, but the illusion was powerful enough to scare its allies. The CIA was now forced to reassure foreign governments that it had not created a psychic superweapon, which only made them suspect that perhaps it had. Such doubts undermined alliances, restricted intelligence sharing, and isolated the U.S. on the global stage. The KGB didn't leak the idea that America had psychic weapons. The world invented that part. But the KGB ensured the idea stayed alive. By 1989, MK Ultra had become a ghost haunting the U.S. intelligence community. Recruits at the CIA's training academy whispered about it like cadets at a military camp. Whispering ghost stories, some believed the experiments were still happening in secret underground labs. Others believed MKUltra had succeeded, but was too dangerous to reveal. A few believed the Soviets had stolen the technology and were already using it. None of this was true, but the truth didn't matter. Fear did, and fear was plentiful. MKUltra had convinced America that the human mind was a battlefield. NAVODCHIK convinced America that it was losing that battlefield. The KGB's psychological victory peaked when a senior CIA officer, responsible for countering Soviet disinformation, wrote a classified memo stating that the United States should assume Soviet cognitive manipulation capabilities exist until proven otherwise. This memo, recovered in a post-Soviet archive, was marked high priority, urgent threat. It was the ultimate proof of NAVODCHIK's triumph. The CIA had officially acknowledged the existence of a weapon invented by Soviet propagandists. In Yasinevo, this memo became mandatory reading for senior analysts. It was displayed like a trophy, a symbol of how thoroughly the KGB had reshaped the thinking of its greatest adversary. Yet the cruelest twist came after the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1992, when Boris Yeltsin temporarily opened KGB archives to Western researchers, a group of American historians visited Moscow expecting to find classified documents describing Soviet mind control programs. They found nothing. No psychic experiments, no telepathic research, no classified brainwave projects. The Soviet Union had never invested heavily in mind manipulation. They didn't need to. The CIA had done the heavy lifting for them. American researchers returned home confused, but some couldn't accept the truth. They assumed the Soviets had destroyed the files before the archives opened, or that the real program was hidden in military labs, not KGB folders, or that rogue Soviet scientists had taken the research when they defected. The myth lived on, not because of evidence, but because it seemed impossible that America had destroyed itself chasing nothing. Nobody wanted to admit the truth. The world's most powerful intelligence agency had spent decades fighting shadows. And then there were the victims, men and women whose minds had been shattered by MKUltra experiments, whose trauma made them living proof of the CIA's desperation. When they came forward in the 1990s demanding justice, the CIA panicked again, fearing new lawsuits and investigations. They quietly settled many claims, sealed testimonies, and paid families to remain silent. Ironically, this secrecy gave more ammunition to conspiracy theorists. The mere existence of settlements looked like an admission of guilt. The truth, that MKUltra had failed spectacularly, was too mundane, too anticlimactic for the public to believe. So the conspiracy endured, and with every retelling, the CIA's credibility eroded just a little more. In Moscow, former KGB officers reflected on NAVODCHIK with pride. One retired colonel described it succinctly. "We built nothing. We invented nothing. We only showed America what America feared most." Another said, "The CIA wanted to control minds. We controlled their fear of minds." It was the purest Cold War victory. Cheap, psychological, elegant, and devastating. America had spent billions on nuclear submarines, spy planes, satellites, and covert armies. The Soviets defeated them with rumors typed on cheap paper. As the Cold War ended and the Soviet flag fell over the Kremlin, one undeniable truth remained. MKUltra had not created a generation of psychic soldiers. It had created a generation of paranoid intelligence officers. The United States emerged from the Cold War victorious on paper, but psychologically scarred. And the KGB, even in defeat, had achieved something extraordinary. They left behind a lingering uncertainty in the American intelligence community that would last long after the Soviet Union was gone. A wound that never closed, a ghost that never stopped whispering, a program that never truly died, not because it worked, but because it failed spectacularly in full view of the world. By the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union crumbled into dust and its successor states inherited vaults of decaying archives and half-funded intelligence programs, the world believed the story of MKUltra was finally over. But the truth was that its most powerful consequences were only beginning. The Cold War may have died, but the psychological rot it seeded inside Western intelligence agencies endured, quietly and visibly, because MK Ultra had never been just a program. It had been a mirror showing the CIA that the human mind could be manipulated, and NAVODCHIK had twisted that mirror until the agency no longer knew whether it was looking at its enemy or its own reflection. Inside Langley, the collapse of the USSR did not bring relief. It brought confusion. For decades, the CIA had justified its darkest actions by insisting that the Soviets had been doing worse. But when researchers poured through newly opened KGB files, they found no evidence of psychic soldiers, no neural weapons, no mass mind experiments, nothing that even vaguely resembled the nightmares that had driven MK Ultra's creation. The revelation hit like a silent detonation. America had tortured, drugged, brain-scarred, and psychologically broken its own citizens because of a weapon that didn't exist. Some officers denied the findings, refusing to believe they'd wasted years preparing for a phantom. Others broke down, realizing their entire careers had been built on chasing a Soviet illusion crafted specifically for them. The CIA had not simply been deceived. It had deceived itself. In the months following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, as journalists and congressional committees demanded access to intelligence records, Langley's leadership panicked. MKULTRA files had been burned in 1973. But what remained? Scattered memos, budget fragments, testimonies from surviving scientists revealed enough to reignite outrage. The CIA's leadership feared not just public backlash, but something far more dangerous: the erosion of institutional legitimacy. Intelligence agencies live or die on their perceived competence. If the world believed the CIA had lost its grip on reality during the Cold War, other nations would hesitate to share intelligence, politicians would hesitate to trust analysts, and courts would scrutinize every covert action more aggressively. For the CIA, MK Ultra was not just a scandal. It was an existential threat. They needed a narrative to contain the damage. And so quietly, behind closed doors, the agency crafted a new myth. MK Ultra had been a misguided experiment fueled by the extreme pressures of the Cold War, but one that had produced valuable insights into human psychology. It was a lie meant to imply competence where none existed. But the lie was fragile because outside the agency, a new form of warfare was taking shape: information warfare, and the CIA was uniquely vulnerable to it. Former KGB officers, now unemployed or reabsorbed into Russia's new security apparatus, began to reveal details about NAVODCHIK. At first, the revelations seemed harmless. Stories about forged documents, planted rumors, and psychological tricks. But as Russian newspapers began publishing interviews with ex-spies who bragged about how easily America had been manipulated, the CIA found itself dragged into a new conflict, a war not of missiles or armies, but of narratives. Russian journalists framed MK Ultra as proof of America's hypocrisy, a nation that preached about human rights while secretly turning its citizens into lab animals. Activists framed the program as part of a broader pattern of government abuse. Conspiracy theorists resurrected old claims, insisting the experiments were ongoing. And through it all, the CIA struggled to defend itself without revealing the full extent of its own past incompetence. But the most devastating blow came not from Russia or conspiracy theorists. It came from inside the United States. In 1994, a survivor of MK Ultra, known only as Patient 64, filed a lawsuit claiming the CIA had permanently damaged his brain through unauthorized drug experiments. During the trial, medical experts testified that his neurological patterns matched those seen in victims of long-term torture. The CIA settled the case quietly, but the settlement became public overnight. MK Ultra shifted from a forgotten relic to a national scandal. And once again, foreign intelligence agencies pounced. China referenced MK Ultra in state-run newspapers to portray the U.S. as morally backward. Iran used it to justify imprisoning suspected Western spies. Even American allies like Canada and France demanded clarification about whether their citizens had been experimented on during joint projects. The CIA's worst fear had come true. MK Ultra had become a diplomatic weapon, and the agency had no defense because the truth was indefensible. Yet while the world condemned the CIA's abuses, few realized the deeper tragedy. MK Ultra wasn't just about crimes of the past. Its legacy actively shaped the present. Dozens of officers who had grown up during the MK Ultra years still held senior positions in the CIA during the 1990s. Many of them still believed the Soviets had conducted similar experiments because those beliefs had shaped their training. Even after evidence disproved the existence of Soviet mind control programs, some officers insisted the truth was still classified, unable to accept they had spent decades preparing for a threat that never existed. This mindset created a generational divide inside the agency. Younger recruits trained in the post-Soviet world approached intelligence with skepticism and caution. Older officers, haunted by MK Ultra's ghost, approached intelligence with paranoia and trauma. The result was chaos. Some analysts dismissed Russian disinformation campaigns as relics of the past, failing to recognize that Moscow was entering a new golden age of psychological warfare. Others saw mind control conspiracies everywhere, misreading routine Russian influence operations as evidence of advanced cognitive manipulation. The CIA's internal compass had been broken by its own history, and while the agency struggled to orient itself, Russia, now governed by a new generation of intelligence veterans, began exploiting MK Ultra once again. In 1999, Russian state television aired a documentary claiming the CIA had attempted to weaponize consciousness and had succeeded. The documentary was filled with dramatized scenes of American psychic assassins, complete with fabricated interviews and stage footage. It was absurd but effective. Millions of viewers believed it. The documentary spread to Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Anti-American groups used it as proof of U.S. technological dominance. Authoritarian governments cited it to justify political repression. Russian intelligence knew that the best falsehoods are the ones your enemy already fears. MK Ultra had become a global ghost story, a Cold War legend that refused to die because the world needed villains, and the CIA had written its own villain origin story. The tragedy was complete. The CIA had destroyed its credibility. The Soviets had turned the agency's shame into a weapon, and the world had embraced a myth more powerful than the truth. MK Ultra was no longer a program. It was a permanent scar, a symbol of how fear corrodes institutions, a reminder that in the Cold War, reality mattered less than perception, and the CIA, trapped between guilt and denial, found itself fighting not an enemy nation, but its own reflection, an intelligence agency terrified of what it had once been, and even more terrified of what the world believed it still was. As the new millennium dawned, the CIA stepped into an era defined not by nuclear standoffs or proxy conflicts, but by invisible wars, wars fought with information, perception, and belief. Yet the agency entered this battlefield carrying the heaviest baggage imaginable, an unresolved past born from MK Ultra and the psychological maze the KGB had built around it. The Cold War was technically over, the Soviet Union reduced to textbooks and abandoned factories, but the scars left on the American intelligence community persisted like lingering radiation. MK Ultra had taught the CIA that fear could justify anything. NAVODCHIK had taught them that fear could destroy everything. And now the agency was trapped between those lessons, unable to abandon the past yet unprepared to face the future. The trauma had seeped so deeply into the agency's culture that even routine intelligence reports were interpreted through a distorted lens. When analysts detected unusual patterns in Russian diplomatic communications in 2003, some older officers immediately suspected psychological aggression, a phrase rooted in MK Ultra-era paranoia. Younger officers, trained to focus on cyber warfare and political destabilization, dismissed these fears, but their skepticism only intensified the generational divide. The CIA had split into two factions, one haunted by ghosts, the other convinced those ghosts were mere myths. But neither faction understood that Russia, now governed by a state built from the remnants of the KGB, had learned to weaponize these fractures. Russia didn't need psychic soldiers or mind beams. It needed something simpler, narratives that America would fight itself to disprove. And so, beginning in the early 2000s, Russian intelligence agencies resurrected the MK Ultra myth once again, dressing it in modern clothing. They launched anonymous websites claiming the CIA was working on neurological influence technology. They funded pseudo-academic conferences where fringe speakers presented fabricated research about mind hacking. They seeded conspiracy forums with stories about electromagnetic brain manipulation. None of this technology existed, but the idea didn't need to be true. It only needed to be plausible, because MK Ultra had already proven that the CIA was capable of unethical experimentation. Russia didn't invent new fears. It revived old ones, knowing they would spread like wildfire because the soil had been fertilized by decades of secrecy and denial, and spread they did. American talk shows began discussing mind surveillance. Activists accused the government of targeting dissidents with voice-to-skull weapons. Even members of Congress referenced MK Ultra during hearings on military research, demanding updates on non-lethal mind-influence technologies. The Kremlin watched with satisfaction as the world's most powerful democracy descended into confusion, debating threats that did not exist. But the most chilling impact of MK Ultra wasn't on the public or foreign governments. It was on the officers inside the CIA who had spent their careers trying to compartmentalize the trauma. Many of them had participated in internal reviews during the 1970s and 80s, interviews that forced them to confront the dark legacy of their own institution. Some had interrogated surviving test subjects. Others had helped destroy classified documents or rewrite internal histories to prevent further scandals. For decades, they had lived in a fog of guilt, denial, and fear. And when Russia began spreading modernized MK Ultra rumors, those officers felt the past clawing at them again. Some grew defensive, insisting the rumors were Russian propaganda. Others grew paranoid, fearing the CIA had restarted similar programs under new names. A few retired early, unable to bear the renewed scrutiny. And that instability did not go unnoticed by America's adversaries. Russian analysts concluded that MK Ultra was not merely a historic scandal. It was an open wound that could be poked indefinitely with minimal effort. They had found a weakness not in technology or espionage, but in psychology, and they exploited it ruthlessly. This deep psychological vulnerability became especially visible after 2016, when U.S. politics fractured along lines of mistrust and conspiracy. Russian disinformation campaigns injected MK Ultra references into online debates, pairing them with modern anxieties about surveillance, mental health, and digital privacy. The tactic was subtle but effective. Whenever Americans argued about government overreach or intelligence abuses, MK Ultra resurfaced as the ultimate symbol of betrayal. This wasn't because people believed in mind control. It was because MK Ultra represented a truth they could not ignore. The CIA had once treated its own citizens as disposable. And if it had done so once, why not again? The CIA found itself trapped in an impossible position. If it denied the allegations too aggressively, people claimed it was covering up the truth. If it ignored them, people claimed silence was proof of guilt. MK Ultra had become a permanent conspiracy, a gravitational force pulling public trust away from the agency, no matter what it said or did. Even inside the CIA's modern psychological operations divisions, MK Ultra was a forbidden term, an infamous reminder of what happens when intelligence agencies lose sight of ethics. New recruits were taught that influence operations should target foreign adversaries, never the American people. But the lesson was taught like a warning whispered in a haunted house. Something tragic had happened here once, and the building was still remembered. Officers who worked in behavioral science units described an unspoken tension. They were encouraged to study foreign psychological strategies, but discouraged from asking about their own agency's history Their MK Ultra had not been buried. It had been entombed within the CIA's institutional culture, a ghost lurking in every hallway labeled DONOTOPEN. And that ghost whispered a dangerous message. Your enemy knows you better than you know yourself. This message crystallized in 2018 when a group of American diplomats in Cuba reported symptoms of dizziness, nausea, and headaches after hearing a strange high-pitched buzzing sound. The media called it Havana syndrome. Some CIA officers privately wondered if Russia had developed a real mind weapon, a modern successor to the phantom technology America had once pursued under MK Ultra. The irony was flawless. Russia had spent decades convincing America such weapons existed, and now the CIA questioned whether fiction had become reality. Investigations found no evidence of a directed energy attack. But the psychological damage was done. The CIA formed task forces. Officers refused assignments abroad. Congress held classified hearings. And even after scientific panels debunked the claims, some officers insisted the symptoms were too specific to be coincidence. The ghost of MK Ultra had returned once more, whispering that unseen forces were attacking the mind. But perhaps the darkest legacy of MK Ultra was not what it did to the CIA, but what it revealed about human nature. People want to believe in mind control, not because it exists, but because it offers an explanation for fear, trauma, and moral failure. It is easier to imagine a hidden puppet master than to accept that institutions can destroy lives through incompetence alone. It is easier to invent psychic weapons than to accept that the greatest danger comes not from supernatural powers, but from ordinary humans abusing the authority they are given. MK Ultra endures not because it succeeded, but because its failure was catastrophic. A program designed to erase memories ended up becoming unforgettable. A weapon that never existed ended up shaping global perception. A psychological operation intended to counter the Soviets ended up empowering them. This was the true horror. The CIA had created the perfect psychological weapon, but it worked only against themselves. The victims of MK Ultra were not just the test subjects who lost their memories, their sanity, or their lives. The victims were the officers who carried the guilt, the analysts who carried the paranoia, the diplomats who carried the suspicion, and the citizens who carried the mistrust. MK Ultra fractured the foundation that the American intelligence community stood on, and decades later, Russian operatives still danced across the cracks. In the end, MK Ultra proved something the Cold War had hinted at all along. The most powerful weapon is not a missile, bomb, or gun. It is the human mind and what it chooses to believe. When historians look back at the Cold War, they will talk about hydrogen bombs, proxy wars, spy planes, Berlin, Cuba, Afghanistan, satellites and submarines racing under polar ice. But when they look deeper, beneath the missiles, beneath the diplomacy, beneath the propaganda, they will eventually uncover a quieter kind of warfare, one that left no craters but carved scars into nations. The war for the human mind, and standing at the center of that shadow conflict, like a monument built from fear and secrecy, is MK Ultra, the CIA's most infamous experiment. The one project that proved a superpower could lose a war without realizing it had begun. For decades, American intelligence believed the Soviets were building weapons that could crack open consciousness itself. They imagined laboratories filled with psychic soldiers, hypnotic assassins, telepathic interrogators, and scientists capable of bending the will of an enemy with nothing more than focused intention. They were wrong. The Soviets built nothing of the sort. Instead, they built something far more devastating, a myth, a whisper, a rumor tailored to fit perfectly inside the CIA's deepest insecurities. The Kremlin never needed to invade the human mind. They simply needed America to believe someone could. And that belief was enough to ignite one of the most destructive intelligence failures in modern history. By the late 2000s, as the intelligence community modernized and younger analysts filled the seats once occupied by Cold War veterans, MK in training academies from Langley to Quantico, it was dissected not as a scientific program, but as a psychological one. An example of how fear, secrecy, and urgency can corrupt even the most powerful intelligence apparatus. Recruits were taught that great agencies do not fall because of foreign adversaries. They fall because of unchallenged assumptions. And MK Ultra was full of assumptions. The assumption that the mind could be turned into a battlefield. The assumption that the Soviets had already weaponized it. The assumption that anything was justified if America fell behind. The assumption that you could erase guilt by erasing files. Those assumptions became chains around the CIA's neck, and the KGB tugged each chain with precision. Even after the Soviet Union disintegrated, those old illusions lingered in the halls of Langley like static in an abandoned radio tower. Every rumor about neurological influence, every conspiracy about cognitive weapons, every paranoid whisper about mind surveillance echoed the same truth. The CIA had lost control of the narrative long before it lost control of the program. And yet the darkest revelation wasn't that MK Ultra failed. It was that failure was more dangerous than success ever could have been. Had MK Ultra succeeded, the world would have confronted it, condemned it, forced transparency, and moved on. But because it failed in secret, because the CIA panicked, burned documents, silenced victims, and buried evidence, the story transformed into a ghost story, one that people filled with their own fears. The KGB didn't need to invent details. They simply needed to leave space for imagination. In intelligence work, a vacuum of information is a weapon, and MK Ultra created a vacuum the size of a crater. Into that crater, Russia poured rumors. The media poured speculation. Conspiracy theorists poured paranoia. And all of it hardened into a myth more enduring than any classified truth. The CIA's refusal to confront its mistakes allowed the world to write its own version of events, and that version, far more dramatic, far more sinister, far more cinematic, became the one people believed. This myth reshaped geopolitics. In the 2010s, when Russia launched massive disinformation campaigns targeting Western democracies, the foundation had already been laid. The public was primed to believe that intelligence agencies manipulated thoughts, that governments had hidden technologies, that unseen forces shaped behavior. MK Ultra had normalized the idea that democracies could be as unethical as dictatorships. And dictatorships exploited that idea ruthlessly. Russian operatives referenced MK Ultra indirectly in talks about foreign interference. Knowing the term alone triggered dormant anxieties in American discourse. Intelligence analysts monitoring social media noted frequent spikes in MK Ultra references during periods of political tension. The ghosts of a program that ended half a century earlier were now weaponized in meme form, disinformation threads, and extremist rhetoric. The human mind, once feared as the target of experimental weapons, had instead become the launch pad for digital ones. But MK Ultra's final impact was not on the CIA, nor on Russia, nor on geopolitics. It was on trust. Institutions rise and fall on trust, and MK Ultra obliterated it in a single generation. It taught citizens that their government might experiment on them. It taught intelligence officers that their agencies could lie to them. It taught foreign nations that American moral superiority had cracks. It taught dictatorships how to disguise their own atrocities by pointing at American hypocrisy. It taught adversaries that a rumor, carefully placed, could do more damage than a bomb. It taught the world that truth is fragile, and secrecy corrodes it from the inside. MK Ultra didn't end in 1973. It didn't end when the files were burned. It didn't end when the hearings closed. It didn't end when the victims died. It didn't end when the CIA restructured. It didn't end when the Soviet Union fell. MK Ultra continues as long as people believe the human mind can be weaponized by anyone except themselves. Its legacy lives in every conspiracy theory, every disinformation campaign, every accusation of psychological manipulation, every moment of distrust between citizens and the institutions meant to protect them. The final irony is that the one true mind weapon developed during the Cold War was not chemical, psychic, or electronic. It was epistemic. It was the weapon of doubt. It didn't need a laboratory, a scientist, or a syringe. It needed only a single question seated at the right time. What if they can control your mind? That question spread like a virus, infecting not neurons but narratives. It rewired not brains but beliefs. And long after the Soviet Union vanished into history, that question still circulates, resurfacing whenever people sense hidden forces shaping their world. MK Ultra proved that the human mind is not easily controlled, but belief is. And belief influences more actions, shapes more societies, and destabilizes more nations than any chemical ever synthesized in a CIA laboratory. So what remains now that the archives are open, the testimonies recorded, the apologies issued? A lesson, a warning, a message carved by trauma into the foundation of modern intelligence work? The greatest threat to national security is not what your enemy builds, but what you convince yourself they have built. The CIA convinced itself the Soviets had psychic weapons. The Soviets convinced themselves the CIA had them. And in that shared delusion, both superpowers created the most dangerous battlefield imaginable. A battlefield inside their own fears. MK Ultra taught the world that intelligence agencies can lose wars without enemies firing a shot. They can lose wars by believing myths. They can lose wars by chasing ghosts. And they can lose wars by hiding their mistakes until the lies become harder to fight than the truth. In the end, the Cold War's greatest act of psychological warfare was not launched by Moscow or Washington. It was launched by fear itself, and fear is the one enemy that can never be defeated, only recognized, only understood, only contained. But MK Ultra proved that when fear is fed, funded, and given authority, it grows into a monster capable of consuming entire institutions. That monster still roams today, wandering through intelligence briefings, congressional hearings, online conspiracies, and public discourse. And every time someone whispers MK Ultra, the monster stirs again, reminding the world that the human mind is the most fragile battlefield ever created.